We'll call the regular meeting of the City of Amherst City Council to order on February 12th, 2018 at 7 p.m. Roll call, please.
Mr. Winarski?
Here.
Mr. Nahorn?
Present.
Mr. Miller?
Present.
Mr. Janik?
Here.
Mr. Van Turen?
Here.
Mr. Dembinski?
Here.
Mr. Cowger?
Here.
Now we will stand for the prayer led by Chaplain Nahorn and then the pledge to the flag by Sergeant at Arms Dembinski.
Please join me in bowing your heads. Gracious God, with President's Day forthcoming this month, we are reminded of the wisdom of our first president, George Washington. As we move forward with the items on our agenda and throughout this session, let us remember these meaningful words. Perseverance and spirit have done wonders in all ages. And now let the words of our mouths and meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your vision. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We'll go to item 4 on the agenda, the consent agenda.
Minutes of the regular council meeting held January 22nd, 2018. Minutes of the Utilities Committee meeting held February 5th, 2018. Minutes of the Ordinance Committee meeting held February 5th, 2018. Minutes of the Community Development Committee meeting held February 5th, 2018. Minutes of the Finance Committee meeting held February 5th, 2018.
Mr. Miller.
Move to accept consent agenda as read, please.
Mr. Dembinski.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to accept the consent agenda as read. Any comments or questions? Seeing none? Voice vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. Motion is carried 7-0. The consent agenda is accepted. Go to number 5 on the agenda, acknowledgement of the public pertaining to items on the agenda. Is there anyone present who wishes to speak on any item on the agenda? Seeing none, we'll go to item 6, ordinances and resolutions, first reading. 6A.
An ordinance authorizing and directing the Safety Service Director to solicit bids to trim trees on a unit basis in the city that interfere with electrical distribution lines at a cost not to exceed $85,000, and authorizing and directing the Safety Service Director to award the contract for such work to the lowest responsive and responsible bidder, and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Miller.
Thank you. We'll move to take 6A to the second reading.
I mean, suspend rules, we can get it, I mean, something we do every year. It is somewhat of a good thing for the citizens to get those lines cleared as soon as possible. I think the earlier we do this, probably the better bid we'll get. So if you want to suspend rules, great. If not, great too. I mean, really council's pleasure.
I'll go ahead and amend that motion then, since this is going out for bid. We'll move to suspend council rules
Okay.
so that 6A may be passed on its first reading.
Mr. Dembinski.
Second.
Motion and a second to suspend rules so that item 6A can be passed on the first reading. Any further comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion passes 7-0. Mr. Dembinski.
Move to adopt item 6A.
Mr. Winarski.
I'll second.
There's a motion and a second to adopt item 6A. Any comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion passes 7-0.
It'll be ordinance 01803.
Go to item 6B on the agenda.
An ordinance approving and accepting dedicated improvements for the preserve at Quarry Lakes Phase 2 and approving the subdivision plat therefore and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Van Truen.
We need a suspension of council rules on this, pass on the first reading.
Mr. Mayor.
I don't see a problem with it. I know there's some discussion at the last meeting. I don't think you were part of that, but I don't remember where you left it. I know you talked about adding emergency. It would help the developer, I'm sure.
I'm gonna not make a motion on this and listen to any.
I mean, you might want to revisit the discussion. I
Yeah.
don't, like I said, I don't
Yeah.
recall
Well, we need
exactly
a
what council.
We need a
Roll
motion
call.
and a second to do the discussion. Mr. Miller?
You do, or can you discuss it before you make a
No,
motion?
we need the motion. Motion and a
Do we have that motion on the floor for suspension or
Please.
just a?
There's no
I
motion.
would move to suspend council rules so that item 6B.
second. Mr. Miller, you need a second.
I'll give him a second so we can have Mr. Brady maybe
Okay,
speak
very good.
briefly on that, if you would.
And first of all, are there any comments or questions from council? All right, Mr. Brady. And Mr. Miller, do you want to have the floor?
Pardon me?
Do you want to have the floor?
I just wanted to have Mr. Brady explain why it would be helpful to suspend council rules and with emergency get this quickly signed and ready to go.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam
So it would be very helpful in that it allows us to file the plat, which allows us to start selling lots. There are a couple minor items that need to be taken care of, none of which have to do with the actual improvements that were installed. They're all, or the improvements that the city council is accepting. The improvements were scrutinized with a full-time city engineer the whole time that they were installed. There was a couple of walkthroughs with the engineering department, as well as various members of administration who also do spot inspections. I'm pretty sure that nothing is going to change with these improvements at this point. They're just sitting there waiting for council to authorize the various city officials to sign the plat and allow us to file it with the county. So any help in that would be much appreciated.
Okay. Mr. Mayor, Mr. Safety Services Director, you agree with what he said about the involvement of the
Yeah, the city's been real involved. We watch them
Right.
all along the way. The city engineers approved them. There were some minor issues with some paperwork and checks that need deposit. Those have been satisfied. So I would have no issue.
Okay, you agree with what he said. Mr. Miller, back to you.
Thank you, Madam President. Just my understanding after our committee meeting discussion, that we still have an occupancy permit that you can hold if there's any issues. Our punch list is not complete.
Correct.
So really, this is just allowing him to get this plat to the auditor, I believe, right? And then start moving on the sales. I see no reason to hold this up. So I concur with my second and have no further comments or questions. Thanks, Madam President.
Yes, and Mr. Van Truen's also indicating he concurs with that. Okay, so the motion and the second remain, and we do have a motion and a second. Are there any further comments or questions? Mr. Winarski?
Yeah, thank you very much, Madam President. Mr. Auditor, I had a couple questions with regards to paragraph 5 and paragraph 6 of the ordinance. It seems paragraph 5 with regards to the 3% has been satisfied. Going on to paragraph 6, is that still up in the air?
Yes, Chuck, I did not receive, prior to the end of the day, any update from the building department on whether or not what the actual amount is. There's a discrepancy between what he believes the bonds are supposed to, the maintenance bonds are for versus what the paperwork came in as. So he was going to check and verify that information.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and Mr. Mayor has a comment.
And we worked late in the day after you left to try to resolve these issues, and we have been able to get a hold of their bond counsel and their people, and it has been adjusted to 25%. We should be receiving that soon, so I got pretty high confidence that this will be arriving at their office.
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to further comment, and while I admire the work Mr. Brady and his team does, for whatever reason, it's just sitting in the back of my head that we're approving something before it actually occurs. I mean, I know a lot of this has already occurred, and we're confident it will, and there's systems in place to make sure that they do, but I'll give this a second reading, but I'm not comfortable signing off on the emergency at this point. I just wanted to let you know, and that's my reason. I'm just not comfortable signing off on something in advance of it happening as if it has happened. And that's the end of my comments. Thank you.
Okay, so you're not supporting suspension of rules.
That is correct. I won't be.
Are there any further comments or questions? Mr. Brady?
So, Mr. Murnarski, what specifically do you feel that needs to be done before you feel comfortable voting for it?
Well, we're approving a punch list, an as-built. The as-built is typically, in my experience, what occurs after a job is complete. The job isn't complete yet, but yet I'm signing off as if it were.
Right.
It makes me uneasy.
So the improvements that council's accepting are 100% complete. There's absolutely nothing that the engineer sees that needs to be done with the sanitary, with the water, with the road construction, with the storm sewer system. So, or the electric. So all that has been vigorously inspected. The items that remain on the punch list are things like, last fall we seeded the right-of-ways and the seed got blown up and the straw got blown up. That's not even an accepted improvement. They're putting us on notice, just saying that these are things that have to get done and the city's gonna hold our feet to the fire. So there's the actual improvements that we're dedicating, that the maintenance bonds cover, they're 100% complete. There's nothing else that we can do with those. And that's why we're respectfully asking council to approve that tonight.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Brady. And honestly, like I said, I admire the work you do. You're an upstanding group. You've done a lot of good things for Amherst. With regards to paragraph 6, which has to do with the 25%, that's still, I'm signing off as if it has been approved, but it's still being negotiated, is my understanding.
There's no negotiations.
Is that, Mr. Auditor? I'm under the impression we don't
I
have.
think there, from my understanding, again, I think between the building department, the numbers they received this morning on the maintenance bonds, we received a check for the $15,000.
Correct.
That covers it. Paragraph 5, which you asked for, but paragraph 6, I think between David and myself, he just didn't understand the difference in the numbers. So if the mayor worked that out at the end of the day, I'm not sure. I'm not privy to that information at this time.
Okay.
May I clarify, please? There's 2 maintenance bonds that are required, and basically what that says is that in the event that we don't come back and fix anything that happens over the next 3 years, that those bonds will cover that. Both bonds were submitted, actually I've had one since December. It was submitted for 10% as opposed to 25%. So when that was brought to our attention by the building department, we immediately got the company to reissue a bond, and it actually comes out. So right now the city has a 10% bond for one of the, for the paving, the actual concrete paving. The other one was filed properly. So.
Mr. Brady, do you know what the total amount of the bonds are?
I don't know. It's based off of the cost of the improvements, yeah. Yeah,
It was
so that's-
25%.
So it was actually a clerical error, and I get where you're coming from with the bonding, but again, the city has all the leverage in this. We put in 34 lots, and all the improvements are done, and we won't even be able to get a building permit until that's clarified, so.
Mr. Brady, could you stay up for one more minute? Mr. Miller has some questions, but first, are you done?
I'm complete.
Are you complete?
Thank you,
Okay.
Madam President.
Hang on, Mr. Miller. Do you have any further comments, Mr. Mayor, on that? Okay.
After talking to the building department and I'm talking to the bond council, I'm 100% positive those are on the way.
Okay, very good. Mr. Miller?
Thank you, Madam President. After hearing from Mr. Brady in committee and also here again, I restate, I totally understand Mr. Murnarski's argument. He has a good argument. I think in this case, though, we're looking at a 3-year bond that won't start until after the punch list is completed. So that means that not only has the engineers signed off on the storm, the sewer, the streets, everything, even electrical, that the small punch list items, the bond still won't start till after those are, and we still have a building and occupancy permits that we still can hold to him. So I think this just allows him to do like anybody else. We want these lots sold. We are competing, this lot in Amherst is competing against other developments in Lorraine County. And you know, if they're not ready to sell now, people who want to buy a house and the market's hot, they're gonna go somewhere else. I think we have a lot to offer, and I think his developments and other builders that come in have a lot to offer. Let's get them to the platting stage with the county. Let's get them to be able to legally sell these lots. And I have no objections to that. Usually I'm not a big fan, once again, of this suspension and emergency, but in this case I fully support that. And I think because of the city's leverage in the 3-year bond starting after the punch is complete, it has me feeling very confident about this. I yield the floor back. Thank you, Madam President.
Okay, Mr. Dembinski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It sounds like there was a lot of stuff that kind of came in semi-last minute. Even if we don't suspend council rules tonight and we suspend council rules next time, it's only a delay of 2 weeks. That might give us the necessary time to go through, wrap up any loose ends, and make sure that when it actually comes back to council, everything's taken care of and everything that's stated in the ordinance has been completed. So, I mean, my opinion as of now is I think I'm going to vote no towards the suspending of council rules, but then next time I would have no issue with it. Just my opinion. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield.
Okay. Mr. Pecora, just a procedural question.
Sure.
If suspension fails, we can still vote to pass it on. Okay, very
Yes.
good. All right. Yeah, I just all right. Are there further comments or questions? Further comments? Seeing none, roll call vote on suspension of rules.
Mr. Winarski?
No.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
No.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Okay, the motion, the vote is 5-4, the suspension,
5-2.
5-2. Thank you. The motion fails, rules are not suspended. I will entertain a motion to move to the second reading. Mr. Cow, pardon?
Madam, I was just clarifying, you need 6 votes to suspend.
Yes.
That's
We
correct.
need 6 votes.
Yes. Mr. Cowger,
Move to take item B to the second reading.
Mr. Dembinski.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to send item B to the second reading. Comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion passes 7-0. Item 1805 goes to the second reading. Go to item 6C.
A resolution declaring the necessity for public sidewalk repair and replacement and authorizing and directing the Safety Service Director to award a contract for such repair and replacement of public sidewalks to the lowest responsive and responsible bidder at a cost to the city not to exceed $500,000 and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Winarski.
I'd like to motion to suspend council rules so this can be passed on the first reading.
Thank you very much. Mr. Calver.
I'll second.
There's a motion and a second to suspend council rules so that item 6C can be passed on the first reading. Any comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion passes 7-0. The rules are suspended so that this can be passed on the first reading. Mr. Janik.
Move to adopt.
Mr. Winarski.
I'll second.
There's a motion and a second to adopt. Comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Item 6C is adopted on a vote of 7-0.
It'll be a resolution R1801.
Go on to item 6D.
An ordinance amending Amherst Codified Ordinance, Chapter 913, Section 913.04.
Mr. Dembinski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I believe this item 6D is supposed to have the emergency included on it also. Can we, how should that work?
We need to add the emergency, correct, Mr. Law Director?
We
And then
do.
suspend rules. Okay, are you going to move?
I would like to move to add the emergency to item 6D, please.
Okay. Mr. Calgar?
I'll second.
The motion and a second to add the emergency clause to item D. Mr. Miller?
I have my notes, just a point of order, I have my notes here that it was moved out of committee with emergency at a 6-0 vote.
Doesn't reflect it in the ordinance.
The problem is the ordinance itself did not reflect it.
So, when
This
the
is to
ordinance
make
was
it
written.
consistent with the, a reading, so you're correct. It's just to make the the document and the activity, action consistent.
So we do have a clerical error in the fact that it wasn't typed on there. Okay, thank you for the clarification. No further questions.
Are there any further questions or comments? Seeing none? Roll call vote.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion passes 7-0. The emergency clause is added to this agenda item 6D. Mr. Dembinski?
Move to suspend council rules so item 6D may be passed on the first reading.
Mr. Cowger?
Second.
There's a motion and a second to suspend council rules so this item 6D can be passed on the first reading. Any comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion passes 7-0. That rule is suspended. Mr. Miller?
Move to adopt, please.
Mr. Janik?
Second.
There's a motion and a second to adopt item 6D. Any comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion passes 7-0, and item 6D is adopted.
It'll be ordinance 01804.
We'll go to item 6E.
A resolution authorizing the City of Amherst by the Safety Service Director file an application with the State of Ohio through the Ohio Department of Natural Resources for financial assistance for public recreational purposes through the Recreational Trails Program, RTP, and/or the Clean Ohio Trails Fund, COTF.
Mr. Dembinski.
Thank you, Madam President. If I remember correctly, this needed to be submitted by March 1st. Therefore, I would like to suspend council rules so that item may pass item 6E on the first reading.
Is there emergency on this?
You may need to report it in.
You can still suspend rules.
Can I suspend rules and then go and add an emergency?
No, you can suspend rules even without the emergency.
Yeah, but they need to have
We
it.
need
We
both.
need
The
to move-
emergency's on there.
Oh, the emergency's under, but it's not in the
It's
title.
not in,
Excuse me.
it's not in the caption, but it's in the appropriate clause, yeah,
So this is fine.
it's fine.
Okay, fine, okay. So the motion to suspend rule is to be adopted on the first reading is appropriate. Is there a second? You see it there?
No, I do not. Oh, it's down at the bottom. Sorry, thank you.
Is there a second? Mr. Winarski?
So moved.
Thank you. There's a motion and a second to suspend rules so that item 6E can be adopted on the first reading. Any comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion passes 7-0. Rules are suspended. Mr. Dembinski,
Move to adopt.
Mr. Cowger,
Second.
a motion and a second to adopt. Any comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion passes 7-0. And item 6E is adopted.
It will be resolution R1802.
We will go to item 6F.
An ordinance providing for the issuance and sale of not to exceed $2,500,000 of notes in anticipation of the issuance of bonds for the purpose of paying costs of improving city streets by reconstructing, resurfacing, grading, draining, curbing, paving, construction storm sewers and related drainage facilities, and making other improvements as designated in the plans approved or to be approved by council and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Dembinski.
Move to suspend council rules so that item 6F may be passed on the first reading.
Mr. Winarski.
I'll second.
There's a motion and a second to suspend the rules requiring 3 readings so that item 6F can be passed on first reading. Any comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Carver?
Yes.
Motion passes 7-0. Rule is suspended. Mr. Dembinski.
Move to adopt.
Mr. Calgert.
Second.
Motion and a second to adopt. Any comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Calgert?
Yes.
The vote is 7-0. Item 6F is adopted.
It'll be ordinance 01805.
We will go to item 6G.
An ordinance providing for the issuance and sale of not to exceed $500,000 of notes in anticipation of the issuance of bonds for the purpose of paying costs of installation and improving sidewalks and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Dembinski.
Move to suspend council rules that item 6G may be passed on the first reading.
Mr. Calgert.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to suspend rules so that item 6G can be passed on the first reading. Comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Calgert?
Yes.
Vote is 7-0. Rule is suspended. Mr. Calgert.
Move to adopt.
Mr. Dembinski.
Second.
Motion and a second to adopt. Comments or questions? Mr. Miller.
So I apologize, I don't have the latest of the ordinance, actual written ordinance. Does it read the same as the agenda, missing, showing 50,000 instead of 500,000, or? I hope there's not, I'm making sure that the typo isn't in there as well.
Says
It says
500,000.
500,000.
Okay, so you do have it correctly there. Okay, that's fine, thanks. No further questions.
It says 500,000 on the agenda, too.
No, it doesn't.
No, it doesn't.
Oh, there's a missing O.
That's
on
what
the
she's,
end.
I was just checking to make sure the agenda matches up.
Yeah.
Just want to make sure it matches up correct.
The
Okay, very
comma
good.
is there.
Comma's in the right place. All right. Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Calgert?
Yes.
Vote is 7-0. Item 6G is adopted.
It'll be ordinance 01806.
We will go on to item 6H on the agenda.
An ordinance authorizing and directing the Safety Service Director to solicit bids for the 2018 street rehabilitation program and authorizing and directing the Safety Service Director to award the contract for such work to the lowest responsive and responsible bidder, and authorizing the mayor to enter into a contract for professional services with Bramhall Engineering and Surveying Company relating to such program.
Mr. Winarski.
I guess Question, if I may, please. No emergency needed, just
You can,
Send it
I
up
mean,
to
it's,
second.
it's one of those deals, the sooner we can get it passed, the sooner the legislation allows me to bid it and word it, and the better bids we can get, and then hopefully get it done earlier in the season, so.
Yeah, we are.
Kind of your pleasure.
as mentioned earlier, we compete with other cities for more than just selling
So it
houses,
would be a
for
good idea to
getting
add it
companies out here to do work for us, so.
If we could.
I'd like to make the motion to suspend council rules and pass this on the first reading, or to
Yeah,
add.
Well,
we
are you
also
gonna
add
add the emergency?
Yes,
Okay, that'll be the first motion, is to add the emergency.
motion is to add the emergency.
Okay, very good. Mr. Nahorn,
Second.
there's a motion and a second to add the emergency clause to item 6H on the agenda. Comments or questions? Mr. Miller?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, there's no punch list that's gonna hold this up or anything like that, that we have to
This
be
is
wary
all-
of a suspension of council rules or emergency right here?
This is for the street program. It's pretty much all engineered, waiting to go to bid. So this is the beginning portion of it.
And it's fully engineered, there's nothing hanging out there. Okay.
And there's a possibility later on, I might find some, I'm still working on the budget. If I find some more general fund money, I might try to make this more for the miscellaneous streets, but, you know, I'm unable to do that this time. I can still add that throughout the process later.
Thank you. Is that complete, Mr. Miller?
Would that be something we would end up bringing to council to amend this
It would. We
ordinance?
did it last year, actually. There was some extra salt money, and actually somewhere through the project, we were able to add a dollar amount to it and get more work done. So not really ready to, I don't want to slow the process down, hoping I can find some more money, so passing this now really is a good idea.
And then we can pass another ordinance that
Correct.
adds later on. Great. Thank you. No further questions, Madam President.
Mr. Dembinski?
Actually, no, thank you, I yield the floor.
Okay, thank you. There's a motion and a second to add the emergency clause to item 6H on the agenda. Any further comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen? Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion passes 7-0. The emergency clause is added to item 6H on the agenda. Mr. Dembinski?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I suspect that a suspension of rules may still be forthcoming. I know there was at least one set of feedback received from somebody in my ward who was planning on attending council meeting in order to speak out in regards to this. So I just wanted to put out there, because I would like all of my constituents obviously to be able to speak their mind when they have the chance. If we come to a suspension of council rules, I will be voting no on this. Thank you. I yield.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Cowger?
I'd like to make a motion to suspend council rules and pass item H on the first reading, or so that it can be passed on the first reading.
Okay. Is there a second? Mr. Nahorn? Second. There's a motion and a second to suspend council rules. Comments or questions? Mr. Winarski and
Yeah,
Mr.
thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to start with an apology. I'm glad Mr. Dembinski reminded me that I was also contacted by the same resident, and while he was unable to join us tonight, it's important to him at least that he join us at the next meeting. In order for that to happen, there has to be a next meeting. I owe this gentleman and the rest of the residents that, and I apologize for neglecting to remember that. And in addition to that, the information that this resident has was forwarded to Olga and Jamie earlier today to share with everyone. So, yeah, I'm going to have to join Mr. Dembinski. I owe this resident that.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Miller?
Yes, there was no time, at least in my world, to read through all those links and all that information that resident had sent. Did you have a chance to speak with him?
I don't think I've seen that yet.
Okay. So if you haven't had a chance to speak with him and I haven't been able to digest that information, I will not be voting for suspension either.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Any further comments or questions? There's a motion and a second on the floor to suspend rules. Roll call vote.
Mr. Winarski?
No.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
No.
Mr. Janik?
No.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dubinski?
No.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion is 3 to 4, and therefore the motion fails and the rules are not suspended. Mr. Dembinski.
Move to send item 6H on to the second reading.
Okay, is there a second? Mr. Winarski.
So moved.
Motion and a second to send item 6H on to the second reading. And I just will comment that you can suspend rules on the second reading if everything's addressed at that time, and that's 2 weeks from now. Comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion carries 7 to 0. Item 6H is sent to the second reading. That's all for item 6. Item 7 is ordinances and resolutions, second reading, item 7A.
An ordinance authorizing and directing the Safety Service Director to solicit bids for infrastructure improvements, including the installation of a storm sewer interceptor within the area of Lincoln Street, Sipple Avenue, and North Main Street, and for roadway rehabilitation of portions of Lincoln Street, Sipple Avenue, and North Main Street, and authorizing and directing the Safety Service Director to award the contract for such work to the lowest responsive and responsible bidder, and authorizing the mayor to enter into a contract for professional services with the Bramhall Engineering and Surveying Company relating to such work, and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Mayor, do you need suspension of rules?
You
on this?
could, I mean, you've already passed the financing, so it would go hand in hand, I would guess.
Mr. Dembinski.
Move to suspend council rules so that item 7A may be passed on the second reading.
Okay, very good. Mr. Nahorn.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to suspend council rules so that 7A can be passed, can be enacted on its first reading. Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Madam Chair. No objections have come forth to the mayor's office or to the council in regards to this issue?
No.
No.
Okay, I'll support suspension, and thank you. No
Okay.
further questions. Yield.
Further comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion passes 7 to 0. Rules are suspended. Mr. Miller.
Move to adopt, please.
Mr. Dembinski.
Second.
Motion and a second to adopt. Are there any comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Vote is 7 to 0. Item 7A is adopted.
It'll be ordinance 01807.
Thank you very much. That concludes item 7. We go on to item 8 on the agenda, ordinances and resolutions, third reading. There are none. And we go to item 9 on the agenda, miscellaneous and acknowledgement of the public. I have one item on the agenda and a second item I wish to add. Is there anyone else? Mr. Miller, do you wish to add a third item to the agenda?
I was looking at
9.
number 9.
Number 9, yes.
Just miscellaneous and acknowledge the public.
Okay, you would like another, okay, I will call on you. And you also, Mr.
Good
Winarski.
timing, yes.
Okay. Is there anyone else who wishes to add an item to number 9 on the agenda? All right, the first item I have is an item 9A, which is a request from Mayor Costello, and he sent a request on January 22nd, 2018. The subject was Design Review Board reappointments. The mayor has said, please be advised that I'm requesting council approve Kevin Scally and Dave Fox to be reappointed to the positions they serve on the Design Review Board. Their reappointed term will expire January 31st, 2021. Please contact me should you have any questions, and it's signed Mark Costello, Mayor. So Mayor Costello is requesting that we reappoint Kevin Scally and David Fox. Mr. Winarski.
As a member of the design review, I cannot speak highly enough of these two gentlemen. They are fantastic additions. Strongly endorse the mayor's move here, and I would make the motion to reappoint them, if that's the appropriate motion.
That's all we need to do.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Miller.
Second, and I think Mr. Winarski hit it on the head. There's two good gentlemen that love our city and serve it well. So continuing in those roles for those two would benefit us tremendously. So thank you again for appointing quality people in those positions that are so important in the design review board. So I have a second, and thank you, Madam President. No further.
There's a motion and a second to reappoint Mr. Scally and Mr. Fox to the design review board. Any further comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Winarski?
Yes.
Mr. Nahorn?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Janik?
Yes.
Mr. Van Turen?
Yes.
Mr. Dembinski?
Yes.
Mr. Cowger?
Yes.
Motion passes 7-0. Mr. Scally and Mr. Fox are reappointed. The next item I have on the agenda is a note sent to me by a resident of the Amherst Mobile Home Park, and I am going to read that letter. This letter is from Ron Rush. I need to put in a grateful thank you to the safety forces of Amherst. If it weren't for them, I wouldn't be typing this today. I upgraded my 20-year-old stove last Saturday by replacing it with a younger but used one. In the process of doing the hookup, unbeknownst to me, I created a gas leak under my trailer. Finished about 3 p.m. Showered and settled in for an evening of TV. 11 o'clock, off to bed. Dozed off watching TV rerun. The next thing I knew, I was being awakened by two people shining a light in my eyes, insisting I get up and get dressed. Police officers. Gas. The whole house is full of it. Neighbor noticed it and called it in. Fire department on the way, 6 firemen and Columbia Gas too. I know I was a little snippy with 1 or 2. I didn't realize the danger of the situation. House was sufficiently aired out and Gittich contacted for a service call in the morning. All is well now. I would appreciate your making mention of the great deeds afforded me by the safety services at the next council meeting. If not for them, I wouldn't be writing this. Thank you, Jennifer. Sincerely, Ron Rush, Amherst Mobile Home Park. Thank you, Mr. Rush, for that very nice note. I appreciate that very much. And thank you to the police department, Mr. Mayor, and Mr. Safety Services Director, and the fire department also. Thank you. Yes, Mr.
Just want to
Mayor.
make one quick comment about that. Our safety forces are great, and we really do applaud them, but let's not forget the neighbor. That you know, the old saying, if you see something, say something. Too many times we just ignore those kind of situations, so let's all as residents keep that in mind.
Thank you
So
very
applaud
much.
the resident for calling the proper authorities.
Thank you very much. Item 9C, Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Madam President. It was nice to see that there was no injuries and the resident, the neighbors, and the safety forces return home. Please keep in your thoughts, prayers, whatever that you can offer at this time for the 2 police officers in Westerville that have lost their lives and won't be returning to their families. I wish maybe a resident or somebody would have noticed the instability of the gentlemen that took their lives, and this wouldn't happen. So please keep them in your thoughts and prayers, and keep the rest of our safety forces, both police, fire, and such. They have a rough and tough job. It's a difficult one, and I sometimes think that we take for granted the dedication that they put forth to keep us all safe. So thank you for the floor, and I yield it back.
Thank you. Item 9D, Mr. Winarski.
Thank you, Madam President. Try and be real brief. This is straying from what the typical commentary at this time is, and this has to do with 2 events I was lucky enough to attend this weekend. Both are sports related. I'll start with Saturday's event, which was the Amherst Hall of Fame induction. It was an incredible event, and it was just really well done. I have to give a lot of credit to Casey Wolf for his work involved, and Dave Zavara, tip of cap, both of them. These inductees are picked from a committee. However, the committee doesn't recommend who the nominees will be. Those nominations come from the community, and that's what I'm mentioning it right now. I dropped off a recommendation form on everyone's, or in front of everyone's chair. If you participated in sports or knew anyone that played sports, please fill out the form. I recommend you suggest it to other people throughout the community to get those applications filled. There's a lot of really good athletes that get overlooked because they were never nominated. So I'd just like to invite everyone to nominate someone for consideration this late or this upcoming summer. The second one has to do with our Amherst hockey team. I was lucky enough, I think ESPN refers to it as like an instant classic. There was a game Sunday. It was for the Barron Cup Championship. You'll see plenty of headlines about that. That isn't what I'm here to discuss. What I want to point out was the class and quality of the coaching staff, the athletes, and the fans. This wasn't a spelling bee. This was a hockey game, and you get tempers. You're playing in a championship for a cup. Amherst was so well represented by the parents, the coaches, and the players. I was really, really proud, and that's what I took away from that. There's other things I could go into. The coaching staff was amazing. Just how they handled themselves. It was really impressive. So I just want to thank them for what they've done for Amherst. It was really incredible. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We will go to item 10 on the agenda, agenda requests and committee meeting schedules.
To finance an ordinance to make appropriations for current expenses and other expenditures of the City of Amherst, State of Ohio during the fiscal year ending December 31st, 2018, repealing all ordinances in conflict herewith and declaring an emergency. And then to technology, A 1813, an ordinance authorizing the City of Amherst to enter into an agreement with Wide Open West, WOW, Cleveland LLC for pole attachments of fiber, coax, and associated hardware. And that's all I have, Madam President.
Thank you very much. Finance, Mr. Cowger.
Yes, I'd like to call one item for February 20th at 7 p.m., A 1812, as read.
Thank you
And
very
that is
much.
complete, Madam President.
Thank you very much. Building and Lands, Mr. Winarski.
Nothing at this time, Madam President.
Thank you very much.
Are we calling for Tuesday or Monday, the 19th?
Tuesday, the 19th is President's Day.
Monday
Yeah,
then.
we
I
don't
mean, Monday
always
is-
skip Mondays.
Yeah, we,
It's President's Day.
Isn't council schedule right now showing the 19th?
It was on a calendar, but I was incorrect in that. Apparently, you do not meet now on these holidays. Is that correct, Mrs.?
That's a holiday by holiday decision, I thought.
No, that's
No.
not accurate.
no.
Pardon me?
Standing rule of council only identifies one optional holiday. The other ones are consistent with whatever's on the calendar.
Yeah,
That's what we recognize.
What was our calendar setting?
Let
The
me dig up
19th, isn't it? Didn't I see the calendar say the 19th?
I did have it on the calendar as the 19th, but it was pointed out to me during my absence, things have changed, and we are actually going to not meet on those holidays.
correct. It is the 20th,
So the meeting is for the 20th.
correct.
And the-
19th is a city holiday. Mr. Cowger, 20th?
The 20th is what I called for.
What agenda item is that?
A 1812.
Thank you.
We have Building and Lands, Mr. Winarski.
Nothing at this time, Madam President.
Streets, Mr. Van Truin.
Nothing at this time, Madam President, please count.
Community Development, Mr. Miller.
No items, please cancel.
Executive, Mr. Miller.
No items, please cancel.
Ordinance, Mr. Dembinski.
No items at this time, Madam President, please cancel.
Utilities, Mr. Janik.
No items, Madam President, please cancel.
Recycle, Mr. Nahorn.
No items, please keep recycling.
Technology, Mr. Dembinski.
Yes, Madam President, I have one item A-18-13, an ordinance authorizing the city of Amherst to enter into an agreement with Wide Open West, WOW, Cleveland LLC for full attachments of fiber, coax, and associated hardware. I'd like to call that for Tuesday, February 20th, following the Finance Committee.
Thank you very much. Police and Fire, Mr. Winarski.
Nothing at this time, Madam President.
Annexation, Mr. Van Truen.
Nothing at this time, please cancel.
Thank you very much. That concludes all of the list of the committee meeting chairs. We'll go to item 11, reports of the administration. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Mr. Pitek?
Yes, sir, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have submitted the month-ending reports from the auditor's office. That's all I have.
Thank you. Mr. Ramsey?
Our January reports have been distributed as well, and you should also be receiving, if you haven't already, a copy of our investment report from Meter. I met with them last week. We have our annual meeting, and I asked that they provide me with an electronic copy so that way I can forward it on to everybody. If you have any questions on it, just let me know. No time limit on that. End of my report.
Thank you. Mr. McCord?
No report, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Mr. Jeffries?
No report, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. I have just a couple quick items. The recreational trail that you passed that's going to be built on North Main Street, part of the application process is public awareness. So we'll be putting a spot on our city's website that they'll be able to respond to comment or make questions. I also invite anybody, just call the mayor's office if they're unfamiliar or don't like the internet. They can call me directly and I'll make sure their comments are heard. And along with the budget, it's going to be a big budget, it's going to be a good balanced budget, but we also have the state of the city that I'll present during reports to the administration on that city council meeting at the end of the month. So thank you, and that's in the reports.
Thank you very much. Mr. Dembinski.
Move to accept the reports of the administration.
Mr. Calgar.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to accept the reports of the administration. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. Motion is carried 7-0. Reports of the administration are accepted. Item 12, acknowledgement of the receipt of monthly reports from the auditor and treasurer. Mr. Dembinski.
Move to acknowledge the monthly reports from the auditor and treasurer were received.
Thank you. Mr. Calgar.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to acknowledge the receipt of the monthly reports from the auditor and treasurer. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. Motion is carried 7-0. The receipt of the monthly reports from the auditor and treasurer is acknowledged. Mr. Dembinski.
Move to adjourn.
Mr. Nahorn.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. Motion carries 7-0. We are adjourned at 7:58 p.m. Thank you.
You're right, Olga. For the purposes of provisioning legal holidays shall be those defined in Ohio Revised Code